Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I thought from time to time it would be really helpful and also really interesting to take a look at kind of not specific events in history, but information that helps us to better understand events in history. So, for example, we talk all the time about battles and military organizations like brigades and divisions and corps and companies and armies. And so it's helpful then to look at what those terms mean at different times in history. So we've done some background into that. So today we're going to do something along those lines. And this is a video called Ranks of Nobility Explained. You know, we talk all the time in history, especially when we're talking about European history over the last 1,000 years, about kings and emperors and dukes and earls and counts and all of those titles that existed within feudal Europe. But what do those mean? Where did they come from? And how do they kind of stack up? And how are they different from one nation to another in terms of what those all mean? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at a channel that we've never looked at before. It's called the Generalist Papers, which I'll go ahead and subscribe to. I try to subscribe to all the channels that I do reactions to. So I really don't know what to expect, but it showed up in my recommended, and I thought, what a great opportunity for us to talk about a topic we haven't really discussed yet. The link is in the description to the original content, as it always is. And be watching for an announcement video here in the next couple of days about some meetup opportunities if you are in the UK, particularly in England. Going to be trying to organize some meetups in London, Manchester, and Birmingham. So if you're anywhere near any of those places, I want to see if there's any interest in that. Probably something in the evening on certain days that I'm there. Try to mention that as soon as I can. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Have you ever heard of Prince Charles being referred to as the Duke of Cornwall, or read the poetry by Lord Byron?
Well, I mean, he was the Duke of Cornwall. Duke of Cornwall is now Prince William, who's the Prince of Wales.
Or simply watched an episode of Downton Abbey following the exploits of the family of the Earl of Grantham? Well, you may have wondered where these terms come from and what they mean. These titles, Duke, Lord, Earl, are all related to nobility. The nobility was and is a social class with its origins in feudal Europe during the Middle Ages. Feudalism was a social and political system in which a king of a country bequeathed land and political privileges to nobles in exchange for services to the crown.
And it's helpful to understand that our modern identity of nations as they exist was not a thing back then. Land was tied to titles, and the titles that were subsidiary to that, the people that were under them, were all tied to that crown, not necessarily to a nation the way that we think of it today. There's some of that, but not the way it is today.
It meant fighting in war. As time turned to the late medieval and early modern periods, this system became more hierarchical and more convoluted, arriving at the somewhat confusing system we have today. In this video, I will be disentangling some of these complexities as I explain the ranks of nobility. The ranks of nobility changed from place to place and changed through time. Some systems were very complex, like in the Holy Roman Empire, whose dizzying geographical and political complexity was mirrored in the structure of its nobility.
So why do you even have these titles? You know, if you're a king, don't you want as much authority and power vested in you as possible? So to elevate people to a particular title seems like you might be diluting that. Well, as populations grow, as laws get more complex, as you're trying to manage all of that, by necessity, you need people who are able to exercise some of your authority on your behalf. And it helps to give them some kind of authority of their own. So, you know, random guy shows up and says, I'm here on behalf of the king. So what? Oh, well, I'm an earl that exercises authority granted to me through my title under the king. Oh, well, that's different. The earl is different than some random dude.
Some systems were more simple, like in the Empire of France, where Napoleon simplified the previously complex system of the old regime. We will be using the British system because it's the best known and is still in use to this day. There are 5 ranks in the British system. In order of precedence, they are Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron.
Now, the funny thing is, you didn't start out with all of these. For example, Duke was not the first one. Duke came later, I think under Edward III. You really kind of start out with earls, and that's it. So layers get added above and below as time goes on. And in some ways, it makes things easier, but in other ways, it makes things much more complicated for the king.
Each with their own female equivalents. In Anglo-Saxon England, before the Norman conquest in 1066, there was but one rank in the nobility, the Earl. The term Earl has 2 possible origins, either coming from the Old Norse Jarl, meaning leader, or Ealdorman from the Anglo-Saxon.
England is such a fascinating melting pot of places. It's not like there's no real English identity. Everything, just like in the United States, where really everything we have comes from somewhere else. We are this melting pot, but so is England. England was this melting pot of, you had the people who were there before the Romans came, the Britons as they were called sometimes, at least in the part that is now England. Then the Romans came, and you end up kind of mixing the Romans and the Britons together, and you get kind of this Romano-British thing going on. And then you get the Angles and the Saxons coming from what is now kind of Germany and Denmark over, and they mix into all of it. And then you get the Vikings landing in the north and the east, and places like York become Jorvik. It was Eboracum under the Romans, and it becomes very Viking, the whole eastern part of England. And so then that all kind of mixes together, and then the Normans come and bring in the French influence, and it's all this melting pot of things.
Which meant basically the same thing. The female equivalent, Countess, gives a hint to what the rank was called in continental Europe.
Count.
Yes, like
and that's where counties come from.
The Earl was the basic noble lord in feudal England, controlling the different counties. Yes, that's where that name comes from.
Yeah, so the county is your basic administrative district. And the counties are pretty ancient in England. I mean, the modern counties are different. A lot of them were changed, I think, back in the 70s. But they still have the historic counties before, they became the modern ones, administrative districts
of the land. Earls are to be referred to as Lord so-and-so and countesses as Lady so-and-so. After the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror introduced the Baron. In Normandy, the term Baron meant much the same as Earl, a representative of the king in different areas of the country.
So there again, you have the French influence coming in, and even the Normans themselves were part Viking. I mean, William the Conqueror's male line ancestry goes back to the Vikings. It was the Northmen, or the Norsemen. They were given that area basically to keep them from continuing to raid France. But by this point, by the time William the Conqueror comes over and conquers England, he's very heavily French. Most of his family tree is French at that point. But they're bringing a lot of that. And for the next several hundred years, the language of the court is going to be French in England.
In this case, called a barony. But during the melding of Anglo-Saxon and Norman societies, both terms were used, and eventually baron became the rank of nobility below that of earl. Barons and earls, who themselves were automatically given the title of baron, were often called to the king's council.
So the earl is kind of a senior baron, so to speak. And at this point, you have a lot of barons, but very few earls. Much like later on, you're going to have a bunch of earls, but not a lot of dukes. And then the earl is going to kind of become less and less of a title.
This tradition eventually evolved into the House of Lords. The female equivalent to a baron is a baroness. And while you may hear barons referred to as Baron so-and-so, the correct form of address is,
Lord,
like with earls, Lord and Lady. In the year 1337, the title of Duke was introduced to England when King Edward III gave his son the title of Duke of Cornwall.
And this is where Edward III, I mean, for for all the things you could say positively about him, and I still maintain he's one of the greatest kings the British have ever had, one of the greatest kings of England. He dealt with a lot. And one of the things I think he got wrong was in creating all these royal dukes, because what he did was he gave much more power to a whole generation of royal family members who are then going to war with each other for the next couple of 100 years. I mean, he's laying the groundwork for the Wars of the Roses that are going to happen 100 years later by creating all these royal dukes among his sons who are going to pass those titles on. And those dukes are going to have this sense of entitlement and this sense of, you need to listen to me as the king because I'm a duke. And there's an elevation in authority that didn't exist before.
After losing his own title of Duke of Normandy. The term goes back to the Roman Empire and was used in the German and French lands after the fall of Rome. Originally, the title of Duke was only held by royals, but was later expanded. It is the highest rank of nobility, and the title is only held by 24 people today in Britain.
Yeah, and in a lot of places, the duke was the highest rank. You didn't have a king, and so you had a duchy that was ruled by a duke, or sometimes a grand duke. But yeah, let's take a look at who the dukes are in the UK today, because people might not know about some of them. So here's the list of the current dukes in the UK. Some of these are actually in Ireland, some are just Scotland, some are just England or Great Britain, some are UK. It's very confusing. The senior of which is the Duke of Cornwall, who's Prince William. And when you see lists like this and they say 25th Duke of Cornwall, that means in the current iteration of that. So, for example, when Prince Andrew, who is the current Duke of York, dies, there will not be a Duke of York anymore. The last person to be Duke of York was King George VI. The Duke of York is interesting because it's very often been given to the second son of the monarch. And every single time the title Duke of York has been granted to a second son of the monarch, that second son has either ended up becoming the monarch because his older brother died or otherwise was no longer monarch, or died without any sons, and things kind of went extinct. So you see these different creations. Every time there's a new creation of it, in other words, a person is given the title rather than inheriting it, it's considered the first one of them. So if you see third Duke of York, that would mean that they inherited it from the second Duke who inherited it from the first, rather than it being granted them directly by the monarch. So let's take a look at this because under some of the existing creations, so example, you've got Edward Plantagenet, Duke of York, becomes King Edward IV. Richard, Duke of York, is one of the princes in the Tower who dies as a child, we think. Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VIII, was the younger brother of his brother Arthur, who was Prince of Wales, and becomes the king. Charles Stuart becomes the king as Duke of York. James Stuart becomes king as James II. Henry Stuart is a Jacobite, and he never inherits the title or has sons that he passes it on to. Then it's created again for Prince George in 1892, who had an older brother who would have eventually become king, but he died. And so George becomes George V. Then you have Albert Frederick Arthur George, who becomes King George VI. And now you have Albert, the current prince, who has two daughters. And so the title will again revert back to the crown or become extinct when he dies, and it can be granted again. So you could assume it's quite possible that in that scenario, Prince Louis could end up being made Duke of York at some point down the road. When William becomes king. So you got the Duke of Edinburgh, who used to be the Queen's husband, but is now Prince Edward, who was Earl of Wessex until then. Duke of Gloucester is Prince Richard, who inherited that title from his father, who I think his father was a brother of the king. The Duke of Kent is, again, that's a title that has been inherited by sons, a son of the king who has passed it down. Duke of Norfolk is the Howard family and has been for centuries. Duke of Somerset, that is an interesting one because that's the Seymour family, who goes back to the brother of Jane Seymour, who was a wife of King Henry VIII. Duke of Richmond was a title that was once held by Henry Tudor. Duke of Grafton, I'm not real familiar with that, but Fitzroy, whenever you see that name Fitzroy, that means that is a male line that is a bastard line from a king. Fitzroy means son of the king, and that means it was a bastard of some king going back. So in this case, if you go back far enough, it's a Charles II is where that goes back to. So it's a male line descent from Charles II, which even the king can't claim a male line descent from King Charles II. Duke of St. Albans, Duke of Bedford, Duke of Devonshire, Duke of Marlborough. I believe they are related somehow to Winston Churchill, because his name was actually Spencer Churchill. Duke of Rutland, Duke of Hamilton, whose name is Alexander, which I think is awesome, and that is the same Hamilton family Alexander Hamilton descends from. I'm not familiar with some of these other Argyle, Buccleuch. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. Manchester has a duke. Northumberland, Duke of Wellington, that goes back, and the current one is a Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. Sutherland, Abercorn, Westminster, and Fife. So there you have it.
Traditionally ruled over duchies. The female equivalent is duchess, and dukes and duchesses are to be referred to as Your Grace.
And interesting, though, that occasionally you'll have a female who will have a title that is not the female version because they are the title holder. When you have a duke and duchess, for example, say Prince Harry, he's the Duke of Sussex, and so his wife is the Duchess of Sussex. But sometimes you'll actually have a female be given the male title. So, for example, when Queen Elizabeth II was queen, she had a dukedom in her own right. She, in certain places, would be considered the Duke of Normandy, and she was also the Duke of. I'm trying to remember. Duke of Lancaster. Yeah, that's the title that actually carries with it a lot of the income that the crown makes, is the Duke of Lancaster. Same thing goes for the title of Marquess, depending on how you pronounce it. Henry VIII made Anne Boleyn, his future wife, the Marquess. I forget the title where she was, but she was given that title in her own right. She wasn't a marchioness.
These three ranks, Duke, Earl, and Baron, are the building blocks of the system, and subsequent ranks are derivatives of these ones. A Marquess is the second highest rank, above Earl but below Duke. The term comes from the Germanic march, meaning borderland.
Yep.
So a Marquess translates to Earl or Count of a march. The word Margrave was used in the Germanic lands before it came to England, being introduced by Richard II in 1385.
That's definitely Richard III that he's showing there, and I think that's who he meant in this case is Richard III.
Whose brother-in-law was the Margrave of Brandenburg. The title Marquess was actually quite unpopular in the time after it was introduced. Many earls were insulted that the rank was placed above their own. The reason given for its higher ranking was because a marquess's territory was on the border, and therefore strategically more important than a...
Yeah, a lot of times your most powerful lords, whatever the title, whether they're dukes or earls or counts or marquess, are going to be your marcher lords, as they're called, because they're controlling the Welsh marches, the Scottish marches. These are borderlands that are your first line of defense against invasions from those places. So where does Henry Tudor land when he invades to take over the throne of England? He lands in Wales and marches through the Welsh marches. The Percys were traditionally very, very powerful lords. Earls, at first, I think Earl of Northumberland, and then later dukes in some cases, because they had land on the Scottish marches, and so they were the first line of defense against the Scots.
A normal county. The female equivalent is Marchioness. They are referred to as Lord and Lady, and in some circumstances as the most honorable so-and-so. Lastly, we have the Viscount. As the term implies, the name comes from Viscount, like Vice President, and the post originated as the office of the deputy to a count, or the sheriff of a county, but later it became a hereditary rank in the Holy Roman Empire in the 12th century.
And the word sheriff itself comes from shire reeve, which the shires being the counties, and that's why a lot of them have that shire or sheer or sure, depending on where you are, how it's pronounced, in their titles. So Staffordshire, Northamptonshire, Cheshire, things like that. But Viscount also very often, a lot of times titles have subsidiary titles with them. And so you'll be simultaneously the Duke of such and such and also the Count of something else. And when that's the case, when you have two different titles, one of which is a higher rank, the person who holds the main title will be known as that Duke of so-and-so, whereas maybe their heir, like say an eldest son, would have the what's called a courtesy title, which is your lower title, and they would be known as that. So there are examples of that even today.
It first came to England in 1440 and was placed above the rank of baron. The female equivalent is Viscountess. They are referred to as Lord and Lady. So those are the 5 ranks of the British nobility. Again, they differ from other historical structures of nobility elsewhere in Europe, and when you study those systems, some questions may arise. Like, why are princes sometimes placed below dukes? And why are some countries not ruled by a king, but a prince or an archduke? And wait, what is an archduke anyway?
Or Grand Duke, or just a duke. And sometimes they get elevated. So there were dukes in Bavaria until Bavaria became a kingdom, and then there were kings, even though it was the same family and the same line.
And what's a baronet? Well, those sorts of questions will have to wait for another day. Thanks for watching.
All right, so that was interesting. Add to the discussion. Let me know if you are familiar with other countries and how they've done things and how they might be different compared to the British versions, which he explained here. So use the comment section below. Let's have a discussion. Let's learn together. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have other things like this, like explaining things, giving background that helps our understanding of historical events and people better, let me know. Thanks for watching.